"No lawyer. You're finished," my brother said loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear. A few people chuckled. My father smiled. Their attorney leaned back in his chair with the confidence of a man who had already decided how the day would end. I stood alone at the defense table. No lawyer, no family beside me, no one whispering encouragement in my ear. Then the judge opened a thick folder and stared at the first page. His expression changed. The courtroom grew quiet. He turned another page, and another. Suddenly their attorney stood up. "What is it?" my brother asked with a grin. The man didn't answer. Instead, he looked directly at me. His face had gone pale. Oh my God. The words slipped out before he could stop them. My father frowned. "What?" The attorney swallowed hard. "Look at her file." The judge slowly removed his glasses. Then he said the sentence that would destroy everything my family believed about me. "She doesn't need a lawyer." 5 seconds later, my father's body collapsed toward the floor. But to understand why that happened, you need to understand what kind of family I came from. My name is Emily Carter. At the time of these events, I was 32 years old and a commissioned officer in the United States Army. Most people who met me for the first time saw a calm woman with a controlled voice and careful posture. They saw someone polite, disciplined, and quiet. What they didn't see were the years that created that silence. I grew up in a small town in Ohio with my father, my mother, and my older brother, Jason. In our house, there was one simple rule. Jason mattered. I didn't. Nobody ever said those exact words. They didn't have to. You learn things through repetition. Jason forgot to do his chores. He was tired. I forgot to do mine. I was irresponsible. Jason got a C on a test. School wasn't for everyone. I got an A-. Why wasn't it an A? The older I became, the clearer the pattern became. My father worshipped my brother. He called him his legacy, his future, the son who would carry the family name. I was simply the daughter, the backup child, the one expected to help without being noticed. My mother wasn't cruel. She was simply tired. Years of trying to keep peace in the house had worn her down. When my father criticized me, she would lower her eyes and say nothing. At 12 years old, I stopped expecting her to defend me. At 16, I stopped asking. The only person who ever truly saw me was my grandfather, Colonel William Carter, retired Army officer, Vietnam veteran, a man who rarely raised his voice because he never needed to. He had a way of looking at people that made them tell the truth. When I was 13, he found me sitting alone behind his garage after my father had spent 20 minutes explaining why my brother deserved a new truck, and I didn't deserve a scholarship celebration dinner. Grandpa sat beside me and handed me a bottle of root beer. Neither of us spoke for a while. Finally, he said, "You know why they're wrong about you?" I shrugged. He smiled. "Because they're measuring you with the wrong ruler." I never forgot that sentence. When I turned 18, I enlisted. My father hated the decision. "You're throwing your life away. You'll quit in 6 months. You don't belong in the military." I remember standing in the kitchen listening to him. Then I remember my grandfather quietly standing up from the table. "Funny," Grandpa said. "What? You said the same thing about me." The room became silent. That was the first time I ever saw my father lose an argument. The Army changed my life. Not because it was easy, because it wasn't. Basic training was brutal. The deployments were harder. The sacrifices were endless. But for the first time in my life, effort mattered. Results mattered. Discipline mattered. Nobody cared whether I was someone's daughter. Nobody cared whether my father approved of me. The uniform didn't care. The mission didn't care. And I loved that. Over the next decade, I built a career. Promotions came. Awards came. Responsibilities grew. My father barely acknowledged any of it. When I became an officer, he changed the subject. When I received commendations, he talked about Jason. When I bought my first house, he asked why I wasn't married. Jason, meanwhile, bounced between failed business ventures, failed investments, failed relationships. Each time he fell, my father rushed to rescue him. Money, excuses, second chances, third chances, 10th chances. The pattern never changed. Then my mother passed away after a sudden illness. That loss fractured whatever remained of our family. My father became more bitter. Jason became more entitled. And Grandpa became my anchor. I called him every Sunday. Sometimes we'd talk about military history. Sometimes baseball. Sometimes nothing important at all. Those conversations became precious, especially because I knew they wouldn't last forever. 3 years later, I got the call. Grandpa had suffered a stroke. By the time I arrived at the hospital, he was conscious but weak. I sat beside his bed for hours. At one point, he squeezed my hand. "Still carrying the family on your back." I laughed through tears. Trying, he smiled. Good. That was the last real conversation we ever had. 2 weeks later, he passed away. The funeral brought everyone together. At least physically. Emotionally, we were miles apart. Jason spent most of the service checking his phone. My father accepted condolences like a politician greeting voters. I stood beside the casket and remembered the only man who had ever believed in me before I believed in myself. A week later, we gathered for the reading of the will. The attorney began calmly. A few personal items, some charitable donations, family keepsakes. Then everything changed. The largest asset in Grandpa's estate was a substantial investment portfolio and several properties accumulated over decades, worth millions, far more than anyone expected. The attorney adjusted his glasses. Then he read Grandpa's decision. The majority would go to me. Not Jason. Not my father. Me. The room froze. Jason actually laughed. He thought it was a joke. Then he realized it wasn't. My father's face turned red. What? The attorney repeated himself. Jason stood up. This is ridiculous. My father pointed at me. You manipulated him. The accusation hit the room like a gunshot. I stared at him. You don't actually believe that. Oh, I do. The attorney attempted to calm everyone. It didn't work. By the time the meeting ended, my father and brother were already discussing legal action. 3 weeks later, they filed suit. They claimed undue influence, manipulation, fraud. They wanted the will invalidated. They wanted everything, and they believed they would get it. Because for the first time in their lives, they were about to discover something they had never bothered learning about me. I informed the court that I would represent myself. When my father heard that, he laughed. Jason laughed even harder. And as we entered the courthouse on the first morning of trial, he leaned toward me with a smile. No lawyer. He shook his head. You're finished. The morning of the trial felt strangely ordinary. The sky above the courthouse was gray. A light wind pushed fallen leaves across the parking lot. People hurried through the entrance carrying coffee cups and briefcases, as if this were just another workday. For them, it probably was. For me, it was the day my family intended to erase everything my grandfather had chosen to leave behind. I parked my car, sat quietly for a moment, and stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My face looked calm. Years in uniform had taught me something valuable. Fear and confidence often looked exactly the same from the outside. The difference existed only inside your head. I gathered my documents, stepped out of the vehicle, and walked toward the courthouse. My father's truck was already there. So was Jason's luxury SUV. The one he definitely couldn't afford. As I entered the building, I spotted them immediately. Jason stood beside a tall man in an expensive suit. Richard Lawson, one of the most successful probate attorneys in the state. His hourly rate alone was higher than many people earned in a week. Jason noticed me first. A grin spread across his face. Well, look who's here. My father turned. Neither of them greeted me. Neither of them asked how I was doing. Neither of them acted like I was family. At this point, I didn't expect them to. Lawson looked me over. Professional. Polite. Confident. Ms. Carter, he said. Mr. Lawson, I understand you've chosen to represent yourself. I have. He nodded. There was a brief pause. The kind people use when they're deciding how much honesty is appropriate. Finally, he said, that is certainly your right. Translation. You're making a terrible mistake. I almost smiled. Instead, I simply said thank you. Jason laughed. You hear that? Even he thinks you're crazy. I ignored him. Years ago, comments like that would have hurt. Not anymore. The courtroom filled slowly. By 9 o'clock, nearly every seat was occupied. Some people were curious. Others were connected to the estate. A few were simply waiting for their own cases. Still, I could feel eyes following me. People notice when one side has a high-powered attorney and the other side has nobody. Or at least that's what they thought. The bailiff called the room to order. Everyone stood. Judge Harold Bennett entered. I had researched him extensively. Former prosecutor. Military family. Known for being fair but exceptionally difficult to fool. He settled into his chair and reviewed several documents before looking up. The proceedings began. Richard Lawson immediately took control of the room. He was good. Very good. His voice carried authority without sounding aggressive. His questions seemed reasonable. His arguments sounded logical. Watching him work, I understood why my father had hired him. Lawson's strategy became obvious almost immediately. He wasn't trying to prove that my grandfather had been incompetent. That would have been difficult. Instead, he intended to convince the court that I had influenced an elderly man during a vulnerable period of his life, a much easier argument. especially because I had spoken with Grandpa frequently during his final years. The first witness was one of Grandpa's neighbors, an elderly woman who had known him for decades. Lawson guided her carefully. Did Emily visit often? Yes. More often than the other family members. Yes. Would you say they were close? Very close. Lawson nodded thoughtfully. Did Mr. Carter ever discuss changing his will? The woman hesitated. A few times, after Emily's visits became more frequent. Yes. Lawson allowed silence to linger. The implication hung in the air. He didn't need to say it. Everyone understood what he wanted them to think. The second witness was a family acquaintance. Then another. And another. Each testimony was subtle. Nothing dramatic. Nothing explosive. Just enough small pieces arranged into a larger picture. Emily spent time with Grandpa. Emily called Grandpa. Emily visited Grandpa. Emily was close to Grandpa. Therefore, Emily must have manipulated Grandpa. It was clever, and if I hadn't known the full truth, I might have found it convincing myself. During cross-examination, I asked only a few questions. Short questions. Simple questions. Then I sat down. That surprised people. I could feel it. Most self-represented litigants talked too much, argued too much, panicked too much. I did none of those things. I listened. I took notes. I waited. By lunchtime, my father looked pleased. Jason looked ecstatic. He leaned back in his chair like a man already spending money he hadn't won yet. When the judge called for a recess, Jason practically bounced out of his seat. Outside the courtroom, I found a quiet bench near a window overlooking the city. I opened a bottle of water and reviewed my notes. A shadow appeared beside me. Judge Bennett. For a moment, I thought he was simply passing by. Instead, he stopped. Ms. Carter. I stood. Your Honor. He studied me carefully, not suspiciously. Curiously? May I ask you a question? Of course. His gaze remained fixed on me. Why are you representing yourself? The question wasn't hostile. It sounded genuine. I considered my answer. There are several reasons, such as, I thought about saying the obvious, that attorneys were expensive, that the estate shouldn't be drained by legal fees, that I knew the facts better than anyone. But none of those were the real answer, so I told him the truth. Because this isn't really about money. His eyebrow lifted slightly. No, sir. I looked through the window toward the parking lot. My father and brother have spent my entire life telling me who I am. The judge remained silent. They never listened when I spoke. I turned back toward him. This time they're going to have to. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then Judge Bennett nodded once. A very small movement, but something about it felt significant. He glanced down at the file tucked beneath his arm. A thick file. My file. I noticed several pages marked with colored tabs. His expression changed slightly, as though he had remembered something, or noticed something. Then he looked back at me. You seem remarkably calm. I smiled faintly. Occupational hazard. That earned the smallest hint of amusement. Indeed. The bailiff called everyone back inside. The judge paused before walking away. Then he said something that stayed with me. Courtrooms have a way of revealing things people work very hard to hide. I watched him return to the bench. At the time, I thought he was talking about my father. I would soon discover he wasn't. The afternoon session began. Lawson intensified his attack. He introduced financial records, phone logs, travel records, every document designed to suggest influence, every exhibit carefully chosen. My father watched with satisfaction. Jason barely concealed his excitement. Finally, near the end of the day, Lawson delivered what he clearly considered his strongest argument. He approached the center of the courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, this case is not complicated. He turned toward me. An elderly man changed the distribution of a multi-million-dollar estate. Pause. The primary beneficiary was the family member who spent the most time with him. Another pause. And that beneficiary now sits alone at that table. His eyes moved deliberately across the room. No legal counsel. No professional representation. No independent verification of her claims. He spread his hands. The gesture practically screamed victory. Then he sat down. The courtroom fell silent. I looked across the room. Jason met my eyes. The grin returned. Slow. Arrogant. Cruel. Then he leaned toward me and spoke softly enough that only a few nearby people could hear. No lawyer, he chuckled. You're finished. What neither he nor my father noticed was the judge. Because at that exact moment, Judge Bennett wasn't looking at me. He was looking at my personnel file. And the expression on his face had completely changed. The next morning, I arrived at the courthouse 20 minutes early. Old habits die hard. In the army, being on time meant arriving before everyone else. Anything less was late. The hallway outside courtroom 3 was nearly empty. A janitor pushed a cart past the entrance. A clerk carried a stack of files toward another office. Everything felt calm, ordinary, almost peaceful. It was difficult to believe that within an hour my entire family would begin unraveling. I sat quietly at the defense table and organized my documents. When my father and Jason entered, they looked energized, confident. The previous day had gone exactly the way they wanted. Their witnesses had performed well. Their attorney had controlled the room, and I had spent most of the proceedings listening instead of fighting back. To them, silence looked like weakness. That misunderstanding would become very expensive. Jason dropped into his chair and smirked. "Sleep okay?" I didn't answer. "Probably not." My father laughed softly, reality finally setting in. Still, I said nothing. Years earlier, their comments would have pulled me into an argument. Now they simply sounded familiar. Predictable. People reveal a great deal when they think they've already won. At precisely 9 o'clock, the bailiff called the court to order. Judge Bennett entered. Everyone stood. Then everyone sat. Something immediately felt different. The judge wasn't carrying the same file from yesterday. He was carrying 2. One was the estate case. The other was much thicker. I recognized it instantly. My personnel record. Not the public version. The complete version. A file that contained years of evaluations, certifications, commendations, educational records, and government documentation. My pulse quickened slightly. Not from fear. From realization. The judge had done his homework. Across the aisle, Lawson seemed to notice the file as well. His expression tightened for a fraction of a second. Then the proceedings began. Lawson stood. "Your Honor, before we proceed, the plaintiffs respectfully move for summary consideration regarding several evidentiary matters." The judge nodded. "Go ahead." Lawson launched into a carefully prepared argument. He spoke for nearly 15 minutes. Every sentence reinforced the same idea. Emily Carter had influenced an elderly man. Emily Carter had benefited from that influence. Emily Carter had no legal basis to challenge the evidence presented. When he finished, he looked satisfied. The room remained silent. Then Judge Bennett turned toward me. "Ms. Carter." "Yes, Your Honor." "Do you wish to respond?" I stood. "Briefly." "Proceed." I walked toward the podium. No notes. No prepared speech. Just facts. Over the years, I had testified in military proceedings, administrative hearings, investigative reviews, and command inquiries. The setting was different. The pressure wasn't. For 10 minutes, I addressed each claim. Directly. Methodically. Without emotion. When I finished, I returned to my seat. Lawson appeared unimpressed. Jason looked amused. My father looked relieved. Then the judge began reviewing documents, one by one. The courtroom waited. 30 seconds passed. Then 60. Then 90. Finally, Judge Bennett removed his glasses. "Mr. Lawson." The attorney stood. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge tapped the thick personnel file. "What exactly is your position regarding Ms. Carter's ability to represent herself?" Lawson hesitated. The question seemed to surprise him. "My position?" "Yes." Lawson adjusted his jacket. "I believe self-representation places her at a significant disadvantage." The judge nodded slowly. "I see." Then he opened the file. The sound echoed through the quiet room. One page, then another, then another. His eyes moved steadily down the documents. Suddenly, he looked toward the plaintiff's table. "She doesn't need a lawyer." The sentence landed like a hammer. Nobody moved. For a moment, I honestly thought people hadn't heard him. Then Jason blinked. "What?" My father frowned. Lawson stared at the judge. "Your Honor," Judge Bennett continued reading. "She possesses extensive legal training." Silence. The judge turned another page. "She has completed advanced military legal education." Another page. "She has participated in federal investigations involving financial misconduct." Another page. "She has testified under oath in numerous official proceedings." The room was completely still now. Even the spectators had stopped shifting in their seats. Then the judge looked directly at Lawson. "According to this file, Ms. Carter has spent years handling matters more complex than this probate dispute." I saw something happen in Lawson's face, not fear. Recognition. The sudden realization that he had misjudged someone. He reached for the copy of my record provided to counsel. His eyes moved rapidly. Faster. Then slower. Then he froze. His face lost color. Literally, the man looked pale. Oh my God. He hadn't meant to say it aloud. The word simply escaped. Jason turned toward him. What? No answer. What is it? Lawson looked at him, then at me, then back at the file. Look at her record. My father leaned forward, confused, annoyed. What record? The attorney swallowed. I could almost see him recalculating the entire case. Every assumption, every strategy, every prediction, gone. Because for the first time he wasn't looking at me as someone's daughter. He was looking at my professional history. And it told a very different story. The judge continued. Counsel, I suggest you proceed with the understanding that Ms. Carter is fully capable of representing herself. Yes, Your Honor. The confidence was gone from Lawson's voice. Not entirely, but enough, Jason noticed. So did my father. And neither understood why. The proceedings resumed. This time, however, everything felt different. The illusion had cracked. The image my family had built of me over decades was beginning to collapse. The next witness took the stand. One of the neighbors who had testified the previous day. Lawson conducted direct examination. Then the judge turned to me. Cross-examination. I stood. The witness smiled nervously. I approached slowly. Mrs. Reynolds, you testified yesterday that my grandfather discussed changing his will after my visits became more frequent. Correct? Yes. You're certain? Yes. I nodded. Can you tell the court when those conversations occurred? She gave several approximate dates. I waited. Then I opened a folder. Mrs. Reynolds, do you know where I was on those dates? She hesitated. Number. I handed a document to the bailiff. Military travel orders. Official records. The judge reviewed them. Then Lawson reviewed them. Then the witness reviewed them. On every date she had mentioned I was deployed overseas. Thousands of miles away. The woman stared at the paper. Confused. Embarrassed. I must have remembered wrong. You must have. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Small, but noticeable. I continued. Did my grandfather ever tell you I pressured him? Number. Did you ever witness me pressure him? Number. Did he ever seem afraid of me? Number. Then your testimony is based entirely on assumptions. The witness looked down. Yes. Thank you. I returned to my seat. The damage was immediate. One witness. 5 minutes. Years of assumptions destroyed. Jason no longer looked relaxed. My father shifted uncomfortably. Lawson rubbed his forehead. And for the first time since the lawsuit began, I saw doubt. Real doubt. Not in the courtroom. In my family's eyes. Because they were finally beginning to understand something my grandfather had known all along. I wasn't the weak daughter they remembered. I wasn't the quiet little girl they ignored at family dinners. I wasn't the forgotten child sitting alone behind Grandpa's garage. I had spent more than a decade learning how to analyze evidence, expose inconsistencies, and remain calm under pressure. And now those skills were aimed directly at them. The next witness was already being sworn in. I opened my notebook, picked up my pen, and prepared to dismantle the next lie. Something changed after Mrs. Reynolds left the witness stand. It wasn't dramatic. No one stood up and announced that my father and brother were losing. No headlines appeared. No sudden confession shook the courtroom. The change was subtler than that. People stopped looking at me like a victim. They started looking at me like a threat. And for the first time since the lawsuit began, Jason looked nervous. Not scared. Not yet. But nervous. The next witness was a former family friend named Robert Henson. He had known my grandfather for nearly 15 years. The day before, he had provided testimony suggesting that Grandpa seemed isolated during the last years of his life. The implication was obvious. An isolated elderly man is easier to manipulate. Lawson led him through direct examination. The testimony sounded convincing, at least on the surface. Then Judge Bennett turned toward me. Ms. Carter. I stood. Thank you, Your Honor. As I approached the witness stand, I noticed Robert avoiding eye contact. Interesting. People who tell the truth usually look at you. People who are afraid of being caught often look everywhere else. I stopped a few feet away. Mr. Henson, how many times did you visit my grandfather during the final year of his life? Several. Several? Yes. Can you be more specific? He hesitated. 5 or 6 times. I opened a folder. Would seeing your visitor log refresh your memory? His eyes widened slightly. The nursing facility maintained detailed records. Every visitor, every date, every arrival, every departure. The document was handed to him. He reviewed it. Silence. Then more silence. Finally, he cleared his throat. Perhaps fewer than I remembered. How many? Twice. A few heads turned in the audience. I continued. Did either visit last more than 20 minutes? Number. Did you speak with him regularly by phone? Number. Did you have access to his medical records? Number. Then how did you determine he was isolated? The witness swallowed. I assumed. The same word again. Assumed. I let it hang in the air. Then I returned to my seat. Another witness weakened. Another piece removed. Another crack spreading through their case. By mid-afternoon, the atmosphere inside the courtroom felt entirely different from the first day. Lawson was still skilled, still professional, but he no longer controlled the room. Now he was reacting, defending, adjusting, trying to contain damage. And the damage kept growing. Then came the turning point. The moment everything truly began falling apart. I requested permission to introduce evidence. Judge Bennett nodded. Proceed. I carried several folders to the evidence table. Jason frowned. My father looked irritated. Lawson looked concerned. The first item was security footage from the assisted living facility where Grandpa spent part of his final year. Months earlier, I had obtained the recordings legally during discovery. The footage appeared on the courtroom screen. The timestamp rolled. Grandpa walked through a hallway, slowly, but steadily. He greeted staff members, held conversations, read documents, signed paperwork, discussed financial matters, asked questions, corrected mistakes, made decisions. Nothing about him suggested confusion. Nothing suggested incompetence. Nothing suggested vulnerability. For nearly 20 minutes the footage played. The judge watched carefully. The spectators watched carefully. Most importantly, the witnesses watched carefully. The image being presented by my father's side was collapsing frame by frame. When the video ended, I stood. Your Honor, the plaintiffs repeatedly implied that my grandfather lacked the mental capacity to make independent decisions. I paused. The evidence shows otherwise. Judge Bennett nodded. Agreed. Jason's jaw tightened. The next exhibit was worse. Much worse. Financial records. Years of them. Bank statements. Transfers. Loans. Withdrawals. Checks. Every transaction had been organized chronologically, meticulously. The projector displayed the records. I walked slowly through them. Over the course of 8 years, my grandfather provided financial assistance to multiple family members. No reaction. Yet. Then I displayed the totals. Jason's face immediately changed. My father stared at the screen. The audience began whispering. The amounts were staggering. Repeated loans. Repeated bailouts. Repeated rescues. Business failures. Credit card debt. Vehicle payments. Mortgage assistance. Personal loans? Thousands became tens of thousands. Tens of thousands became hundreds of thousands. Every time Jason failed, Grandpa helped. Every time my father asked, Grandpa gave. And according to the records, very little had ever been repaid. I turned toward the witness table. Would either plaintiff like to dispute these documents? Neither spoke. Because they couldn't. The records came directly from the financial institutions. Certified. Verified. Accurate. Then came the final blow. The evidence I had protected until the perfect moment. Emails. Hundreds of them. Most were harmless. Family discussions, estate planning questions, financial concerns. But buried among them were messages neither Jason nor my father expected anyone to find. Messages exchanged between them. Messages discussing Grandpa's will. Messages discussing how much money they expected to inherit. Messages discussing ways to pressure him. The courtroom became absolutely silent. One email appeared on the screen. Then another. Then another. Jason's own words stared back at him. If Grandpa changes his mind, we're screwed. Another. You need to talk to him again. Another. He can't leave that money to Emily. I watched the color drain from my father's face. Watched Jason stare at the screen. Watched Lawson slowly close his eyes. He hadn't known. That much was obvious. Then I displayed the recording. The one piece of evidence I had never wanted to use. Because hearing Grandpa's voice again hurt. Even now. Even after all this time. The recording began. His voice filled the courtroom. Older. Softer. But unmistakably strong. Someone off camera asked him a question about the estate. Then Grandpa answered. If anyone deserves it, Emily does. Silence. She never asked me for anything. The room remained frozen. She never treated me like a bank account. I swallowed hard. Because hearing that still affected me. Even years of military training couldn't stop that. Then came the sentence that ended everything. She loved me before she knew what I owned. No one moved. No one spoke. The recording ended. The silence afterward felt enormous. Judge Bennett looked toward my father. Then toward Jason. Then toward Lawson. Finally, he folded his hands. Counsel. Lawson stood slowly. He looked exhausted, defeated, like a man realizing the battle had already ended. Yes, Your Honor. The judge's voice remained calm, professional, controlled, yet somehow more intimidating than shouting. Do you wish to continue arguing undue influence? Lawson glanced at the evidence, the emails, the financial records, the recordings, the footage. Then he looked at his clients. Neither man could meet his eyes. No, Your Honor. The words landed harder than any verdict, because they came from their own attorney. Jason lowered his head. My father stared blankly at the table, and for the first time in my life, neither of them looked powerful. They looked small. Judge Bennett shifted his attention directly toward my father. His expression hardened. Sir. My father looked up. Do you understand the seriousness of what you've done here? My father opened his mouth. No words came out. For several seconds, he simply stared at the judge, then at me, then back at the evidence, as if he still couldn't understand how everything had slipped away. But the worst part wasn't losing the case. The worst part was realizing that the daughter he had underestimated his entire life was the one who had exposed all of it. And we were not finished yet. The final day of the trial felt strangely quiet, not because the courtroom was empty. It wasn't. Word had spread. More spectators filled the benches than on any previous day. Several attorneys from other courtrooms slipped inside during breaks. Clerks lingered near the back wall longer than necessary. People sensed they were about to witness the ending of something. They just didn't know how dramatic that ending would be. I arrived early again. As I walked into the courtroom, I saw Jason already seated. For the first time since this lawsuit began, he didn't smirk. He didn't make jokes. He didn't even look at me. His confidence had vanished somewhere between Grandpa's recording and the mountain of evidence sitting on the court's desk. My father looked even worse, older, smaller. The past few days seemed to have aged him years. A strange feeling settled over me. Not satisfaction, certainly not happiness. Something closer to sadness. Because despite everything, this was still my father. The man who taught me how to ride a bicycle. The man who used to carry me on his shoulders when I was little. The man who somehow became someone I barely recognized. The bailiff called the court to order. Judge Bennett entered. Everyone stood, then sat. The judge reviewed several final documents before speaking. His voice was calm, measured, but final. The kind of voice people use when the decision has already been made. After reviewing the evidence presented, this court finds no basis for the plaintiff's claims of undue influence, coercion, fraud, or incapacity. Jason closed his eyes. My father stared straight ahead. The judge continued. The will of William Carter shall remain fully valid and enforceable. A wave of whispers moved through the room. Then came the next part. The plaintiff's petition is denied in its entirety. Denied. One word. Years of resentment reduced to one word. The judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, the plaintiffs shall bear responsibility for all applicable court costs associated with this action. Jason looked like someone had punched him. My father simply sat motionless. For most people, that would have been the end. Case closed. Decision entered. Everyone goes home. But there was still one final matter. I stood. Your Honor. Judge Bennett looked toward me. Yes, Ms. Carter. I have one additional request. The room became silent again. Lawson frowned. Jason looked confused. My father suddenly appeared nervous. The judge nodded. Proceed. I walked to the evidence table and picked up another folder, one that had never been discussed publicly, one I had intentionally saved until the end. Because unlike the inheritance dispute, this wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. I handed copies to the court, to opposing counsel, to the clerk. Judge Bennett reviewed the first pages, then the second, then the third. His expression changed. What exactly is this? Financial disclosures connected to the estate, Your Honor. The judge kept reading. The room felt frozen. Then he looked up. These assets were not disclosed. No, sir. Jason's head snapped toward my father. What assets? My father said nothing. The judge turned another page, then another. I could see his jaw tighten. Not common for him, which meant the information was serious. Very serious. These records suggest substantial transfers occurred shortly before the estate proceedings began. Yes, Your Honor. And these transfers were never reported. No, sir. Jason looked completely lost now. What is he talking about? Still no answer from Dad. The silence told its own story. Slowly, painfully, Jason began realizing something. The hidden transactions. The missing disclosures. The unexplained withdrawals. His father had kept secrets from everyone, including him. The judge placed the documents on the bench. His gaze settled on my father. "Sir, do you wish to explain these records?" My father swallowed. For a moment I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then I remembered every year he spent teaching me that my value depended on his approval. Every accomplishment he ignored. Every success he minimized. Every moment he chose Jason over me. "Sir?" the judge asked again. My father's voice barely emerged. "I don't." The answer sounded weak. Hopeless. The judge nodded once. "I see." Then he addressed the clerk. "I want copies forwarded for further review." The words were careful. Professional. But everyone understood what they meant. Potential investigation. Potential consequences. Potential legal exposure. Jason stared at his father. "You knew about this?" No answer. "Dad." Nothing. The silence was devastating. Not because of what was said. Because of what wasn't. For perhaps the first time in his life, Jason realized he wasn't the favored son anymore. He was simply another person standing beside a man who had made terrible choices. The hearing officially ended several minutes later. People began gathering their belongings. Conversations started. Chairs moved. Papers shuffled. Life resumed. But my father remained seated, motionless, staring downward. I gathered my documents slowly. There was no celebration. No triumphant speech. No dramatic victory pose. Real life rarely works that way. Victories often feel quieter than people imagine. I placed the final folder into my briefcase. Then I heard my name. Emily. I turned. My father stood several feet away. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The courtroom around us continued emptying. He looked exhausted. Not angry. Not defensive. Just tired. I never thought... His voice broke. He stopped. "Tried again. I never thought you'd become this." I looked at him carefully. The strange thing was that I wasn't angry anymore. Anger requires energy. Years earlier, I had run out of that. "You never really looked," I said softly. The words weren't cruel. They were simply true. His eyes lowered. Because he knew it was true too. The silence stretched between us. Then he whispered something I had waited my entire childhood to hear. I was wrong. 3 words. 30 years late. I wish I could tell you they fixed everything. They didn't. Some wounds heal. Others become scars. You learn to live with them. My father took a step toward me. Then another. Suddenly his hand moved to his chest. His face twisted. Confusion. Pain. Shock. Everything happened at once. "Dad," Jason shouted. My father stumbled. The color vanished from his face. Several people rushed forward. Someone called for medical assistance. The courtroom erupted into chaos. And then my father collapsed. Exactly like that. One moment standing. The next on the floor. Jason dropped beside him. "Dad, Dad!" Panic filled his voice. Real panic. Not the arrogance. Not the entitlement. Just fear. Raw fear. I stood frozen. Not because I hated him. Not because I wanted revenge. Because despite everything, seeing your father lying on the courtroom floor never feels normal. The paramedics arrived quickly. They worked fast. Professional. Focused. Within minutes, they transported him from the courthouse. The room slowly emptied afterward. Jason left with them. For once, he had nothing to say. Neither did I. An hour later, I walked outside alone. The afternoon sun hung low above the city skyline. The air felt lighter somehow. Not because I had won. Because something was finally over. For years, I had chased my father's approval. Worked harder. Achieved more. Sacrificed more. Believing that eventually he would see me. Respect me. Choose me. But standing there watching traffic move through the streets, I finally understood something Grandpa had known all along. The people who refuse to see your worth cannot give you your value. Only you can do that. My grandfather saw it long before I did. And because he did, he changed my life. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or treated like you were never enough, I hope you remember this. You do not need someone's permission to become who you were meant to be. And sometimes the most powerful victory isn't proving them wrong. It's finally realizing you never needed them to be right. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story touched you in any way, leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I'd love to hear your thoughts and your own experiences. And if you enjoy stories about resilience, family justice, and second chances, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next journey. We have many more stories to share together. My sister didn't introduce me that night, she introduced my dog. I was still 3 steps from the patio when I heard it, her voice light and polished, carrying just enough to pull attention without sounding like she was trying. And this, Chelsea said, giving the leash a small, elegant flick of her wrist, is our new security detail. Laughter, admiration, a few impressed whistles. Someone asked what breed he was. Someone else asked how much he cost. Another guest leaned in, half joking. "That thing looks like it could take down a grown man." Chelsea smiled like she'd earned it. And my father, standing just behind her with a glass of bourbon in his hand, didn't correct her. He didn't even hesitate. He just nodded once, slow and satisfied, like everything was exactly where it belonged. I stopped walking. Not because I was surprised, not because I was angry, because in that moment something shifted, quiet and precise, the way it always does before people make a mistake they don't understand yet. Titan didn't look at her. That was the first thing I noticed. He stood beside Chelsea, leash held too loosely in her manicured hand, posture rigid, but controlled, ears forward, not toward the crowd, not toward the noise, not toward her. Toward something else. Or someone. Me. His eyes locked onto mine from across the patio, steady, unblinking, waiting. Good. At least one of us still understood the situation. The smell of grilled steak hung thick in the air, mixing with expensive perfume, and something faintly artificial, like everything about this place had been curated to look effortless. String lights stretched across the backyard, casting a warm glow over polished stone and perfectly arranged furniture. Champagne flutes clinked softly as people moved through the space, smiling, performing, pretending. Chelsea thrived in places like this. She always had. If something could be displayed, she would display it. If something looked valuable, she would claim it. Growing up, it had been smaller things, my clothes, my books, my friends. Later, it was bigger, my time, my space, my silence. Now it was my dog. Or at least that's what everyone here thought. I stepped forward again, slow, measured, not rushing to correct anything. Not yet. "Where'd you get him?" a man in a tailored navy suit asked, crouching slightly to get a closer look at Titan. Chelsea didn't miss a beat. "We just brought him in," she said smoothly. "Private training. Top tier," Bradley insisted. Bradley, her husband, stood a few feet away, nodding like he'd been part of the decision from the start. He didn't look at me when I approached. He didn't need to. People like him rarely look at what they think they've already assessed. "That's a Belgian Malinois, right?" another guest added. "Yeah," Bradley answered this time, stepping in, voice confident. "Best there is." Titan didn't react. No tail wag, no curiosity, no engagement. Just that same stillness, that same focus. On me. I reached the edge of the group and stopped just outside the circle of attention, close enough to see the details, far enough to stay out of the performance. Chelsea saw me then. Of course she did. Her smile didn't fade, it sharpened. "Oh," she said, turning slightly, angling her body so Titan was fully visible between us, "you made it." Not "I'm glad you're here," not "come join us." Just acknowledgement, controlled, measured. Possessive. My father followed her gaze and finally looked at me. His expression didn't change much. It never did. Years of command had carved that into him, calm, unreadable, authoritative. Even retired, he carried it like a second skin. "You're late," he said. I glanced at my watch, then back at him. "I'm on time." He didn't argue. He just took a slow sip of his drink and looked away like the distinction didn't matter. It didn't, not to him. Control wasn't about being right. It was about being unquestioned. Chelsea shifted her grip on the leash, drawing Titan slightly closer to her side like she was adjusting a piece of jewelry. "Everyone's been asking about him," she continued, voice light, almost playful. "He's been a hit." I let my gaze drop briefly to her hand on the leather, then back to her face. "He usually is," I said. A few people in the group exchanged glances, sensing something just beneath the surface but not quite understanding it. That tension, the one that sits right between polite conversation and something sharper, that's where curiosity lives. Chelsea smiled wider, but there was a flicker behind it now. "Well," she said, giving the leash another small tug, "he's in better hands now." Titan didn't move. Not even a shift of weight. Her fingers tightened slightly, subtle enough that most people wouldn't notice. I did. So did he. "Sit," she said softly, like she was testing him. "Nothing." She laughed, a short, dismissive sound. Still adjusting, she added quickly, glancing around for reassurance. "New environment." Bradley nodded. "He'll get there." I said nothing. Didn't correct them, didn't step in. Because Titan wasn't confused. He wasn't adjusting. He was holding. There's a difference, and only one of us in that space understood it. I moved past the group without another word, heading toward the drink table near the far end of the patio. The conversation behind me picked back up slightly louder than before, like people were trying to smooth over something they couldn't quite name. Ice clinked as I picked up a glass. I didn't drink it right away. Instead, I turned just enough to keep Titan in my peripheral vision. That's when I saw it. Not the leash, not Chelsea. The direction of his focus. He wasn't just looking at me anymore. His gaze shifted briefly precisely past me. Toward the house. More specifically, toward the lower level. I followed the line without turning my head too obviously. The sliding glass doors were open, leading into the main living area. Beyond that, a hallway. And at the far end of that hallway, partially obscured by a decorative console table and a strategically placed piece of art, a door. Plain, solid, closed. It didn't match the rest of the house. Everything else was open, concept, glass, light, visibility. This door was different, reinforced, intentional. Hidden but not enough. Titan's ears twitched. Once. Subtle. Then his attention snapped back to me like he'd checked something and confirmed it. My fingers tightened slightly around the glass. Not emotion. Recognition. Patterns don't lie, training doesn't improvise. If he was marking something, there was a reason. Behind me, Chelsea's voice rose again, louder now, pulling attention back to her. We're thinking of installing additional cameras, she was saying, just to match him. A few people laughed. My father chuckled under his breath. Satisfied. Of course he was. From his perspective, everything made sense. His older daughter successful, visible, in control. His younger one quiet, distant, difficult, finally stepping back. Order restored. That's what he believed. I took a slow sip of my drink, letting the cold settle before I set the glass down. Titan looked at the door again. Not curious. Not distracted. Focused. Waiting. I exhaled once steady. That basement door, I said under my breath, just loud enough for myself. Then I stopped. Because in that moment, I understood something they didn't. This wasn't about a dog, and it definitely wasn't over. I didn't confront Chelsea that night. That was what she wanted. She wanted me to cross the patio, take the leash back, make a scene in front of her guests so she could tilt her head, lower her voice, and turn me into the problem. Chelsea had always been strongest inside chaos. She didn't have to clean up. She knew how to bait emotion, how to let it bloom in public, and how to stand just far enough from the mess to look innocent when it landed. So I didn't give her that. Instead, I watched. The house was too bright inside. Every surface reflected something light glass polished stone people who looked like they'd dressed for each other rather than for the evening. Music drifted through hidden speakers, low enough to sound expensive. Somewhere in the kitchen, silverware clicked against serving trays. Someone laughed too loudly near the dining room entrance, and the sound carried farther than it should have. I moved through it all without urgency, one hand in my pocket, the other loose at my side. Not drifting, tracking. Titan stayed near Chelsea for appearances, but the pattern was already obvious. Every few minutes, no matter who approached him, no matter what Chelsea said, no matter how many times Bradley placed a hand on his back like he was trying to claim ownership through touch, Titan's attention returned to the same place. The basement door. Not the hallway in general, not the lower level, the door itself. He would hold for a few seconds, scan the room, then settle again, ears forward, posture, tight eyes narrowing just enough to tell me he was still processing. Detection dogs don't get distracted by chandeliers and curated landscaping. They don't care about image. They care about anomalies, scent, pattern, trace elements where trace elements shouldn't be. And whatever he was getting from that door, it mattered enough that he couldn't let it go. I crossed into the kitchen and picked up a napkin I didn't need. From there, I had a cleaner angle down the hallway. The door sat recessed into the wall, painted the same muted cream as everything around it, almost invisible if you weren't looking for it. There was no decorative molding around the frame, no spotlight above it, no attempt to make it belong. It looked like someone had tried to hide it by refusing to acknowledge it existed. That usually works on guests. It doesn't work on people trained to notice what doesn't fit. Still doing that thing where you disappear into corners. Chelsea's voice came from behind me, smooth and close. I turned just enough to face her. She had handed Titan's leash off to Bradley for the moment, probably so she could hold a martini glass with both hands and look effortless. Her dress was the kind of cream silk that only looked simple because it was expensive. Her makeup was perfect. Her smile was not. "I'm standing in a kitchen," I said, not exactly covert. She gave a short laugh and leaned one shoulder against the marble island like we were having a sisterly moment. "You know," she said, "for someone who claims not to care, you've been staring at him a lot." I looked past her. Titan had already noticed she'd walked away. Not because he cared, because the leash had changed hands. He adjusted once, then looked right past Bradley's leg and down the hall again. "I'm making sure he's comfortable," I said. Chelsea's eyes narrowed very slightly. "He looks comfortable to me." "No," I said, "he looks alert." She took a sip from her glass and set it down with exaggerated calm. "You always did this." "Did what?" "Talk like everyone else is stupid." I almost smiled. That line was old, familiar. Chelsea used it whenever she sensed she was outside her depth but didn't want to admit it. Growing up, it had been math homework, college applications, car repairs, anything I understood that she didn't. She treated competence like arrogance if it wasn't hers. "I didn't say anyone was stupid," I said. "You didn't have to." She tipped her chin, slightly studying me. "You know Dad was worried about you coming tonight." There it was. Not direct enough to challenge, just enough to poison the air. I didn't respond, so she continued. "He said big crowds haven't exactly been your thing since—" She let the sentence trail off soft enough to imply concern, loud enough to be heard by the two guests near the pantry. "Since deployment. Since the thing people like Chelsea referenced without understanding because trauma sounded useful when she needed a social advantage." I held her gaze. "Interesting? What is?" "That you think pretending to care makes that less ugly." Her expression changed for a second. Not anger, not yet. Something tighter. Something closer to embarrassment because deep down she knew exactly what she was doing. Then it passed. "You're being dramatic," she said lightly. "I'm just saying maybe this isn't the best environment for you to be handling a working dog." There was that phrase again. Working dog. She didn't even realize she was getting warmer. "Who told you that?" I asked. She tilted her head. "Told me what?" "That phrase." A pause. Half a beat too long. Then she smiled. "Oh, please. You act like everything about you is classified." "Not everything," I thought. "Just the parts you can't afford to misunderstand." Bradley walked in then, leash in hand, already irritated. "He keeps pulling toward that hall," he muttered. "What is his problem?" Titan was not pulling. He was resisting redirection. Important distinction. Chelsea took the leash back from him with a little sigh, embarrassed now that the dog wasn't performing properly in front of guests. She gave the leather a sharper tug than before. Heel. Titan didn't move. Not one step. He stayed exactly where he was, eyes on the basement door muscles still beneath his coat like a drawn cable. Bradley looked at me. "You train him to ignore women or something." I turned slowly. "No," I said. "I trained him to ignore nonsense." That landed harder than I intended, or maybe exactly as hard as it should have. Bradley's jaw tightened. Chelsea's nostrils flared once. Neither of them spoke right away. My father's voice entered before they could recover. "That's enough." He didn't raise it. He never had to. Gregory stepped into the kitchen in pressed slacks and a dark blazer bourbon still in hand posture, as upright as if someone might inspect him at any moment. Retirement hadn't softened him. It had only removed the parts of him that had to pretend. The guests nearby quieted without meaning to. He looked at Chelsea first, then Bradley, then finally me. "This evening is not about old resentments," he said. "No, it was about live ones." I folded the napkin once and set it down. Then maybe people should stop creating new ones. His expression cooled. "You came into your sister's home," he said, "and instead of behaving like family, you've spent the night observing everyone like a hostile witness." Chelsea gave a small, wounded laugh under her breath, exactly on cue. I looked at him, really looked. He always did this part so cleanly, framed the situation as unity, recast control as order, make obedience sound like maturity. Family, I said, doesn't usually start with theft. Bradley shifted instantly. "Oh, for God's sake, it's a dog." Titan's ears twitched again at the change in tone, but his attention didn't leave the hall. My father stepped closer. He's being properly housed here, Gregory said. Safer, more useful. Useful. That word didn't surprise me. It fit him too well. For who, I asked. For people who understand security, Bradley snapped. I let that sit. Then I looked down the hallway again. Titan did the same thing at the exact same moment. And there it was small, precise, impossible to ignore now. The first crack. He wasn't guarding the house. He was indicating something inside it. I didn't stay for dessert. Chelsea made a point of announcing it, something about me needing air delivered, with a smile that suggested concern to anyone who didn't know her well enough to hear the edge. A few guests glanced my way. Bradley didn't. My father watched me leave like he was taking note of a variable he'd already decided didn't matter. Titan didn't follow me. He stayed exactly where he was supposed to be. That was the only part that mattered. Outside, the night air felt cleaner than anything inside that house. Cooler, sharper, real. I walked past the line of parked cars without looking back, unlocked mine, and got in without rushing. The interior light flicked on, then off. The quiet settled. No adrenaline, no anger. Just alignment. I started the engine, let it idle, and pulled my laptop from the passenger seat. The screen lit up the space in a soft blue glow. For a second, nothing moved. Then I tapped a key, entered a sequence from muscle memory, and the system came online. Secure channel, encrypted access. No noise, no drama. Just data. The map loaded, first satellite overlay, high resolution, stitched in layers most people never see. A single red point pulsed at the center of the screen, steady and precise like a heartbeat you could measure if you knew how to read it. Titan. I leaned back, one elbow on the console, eyes fixed on that dot. Show me, I said under my breath. Telemetry populated along the side panel in clean columns, heart rate, respiration, body temperature, movement vectors. All within expected ranges, controlled, focused, not a hint of panic. Good. Then I expanded the behavior log. Timestamps aligned with what I'd seen. Repeated orientation toward a fixed coordinate, duration increasing with each cycle, minor resistance when redirected, no engagement with external stimuli unless it intersected that line. Not random. Not curiosity. Indication. I zoomed in. The map transitioned smoothly from neighborhood to property, from property to structure. Chelsea's house came into full detail, glass stone symmetry designed for cameras. The backyard I'd just left glowed under string lights. The interior layout unfolded in layers as I adjusted the settings. Living room, kitchen, hallway. And then lower level. I isolated the basement footprint. Larger than it should have been based on public records. Reinforced perimeter. Single access point. The door. I tapped the coordinates. The red dot snapped directly over it. Dead center. Of course, I murmured. I pulled up Titan's training profile, scrolling through deployment logs and certification data, explosives detection, narcotics, currency trace, residual chemical signatures tied to manufacturing processes most people only read about in reports they don't understand. High accuracy, low false positive rate. He didn't guess. He confirmed. I sat there for a few seconds, letting that settle into something usable. Then I shifted to Bradley. Name, business filings, property acquisitions. A pattern started to form almost immediately. Rapid growth over the last 18 months. Investments that didn't align cleanly with declared income. Renovation permits filed 6 months ago for structural improvements. No detailed disclosures. Convenient. I opened another panel and cross-referenced supply chain reports flagged in internal systems. Nothing that would trigger an automatic investigation, but enough anomalies clustered around companies Bradley had touched to raise questions. Questions most people wouldn't know to ask. I looked back at the map. The red dot pulsed again, steady. Then it spiked. Not dramatically, not enough for a civilian to notice. Enough for me. Heart rate elevated 140, then stabilizing. I leaned forward. Talk to me, I said quietly. The behavioral overlay shifted. Alert mode active. That didn't happen because of a loud noise. It didn't happen because someone tugged the leash too hard or raised their voice. Titan had been through environments that would break most people without flinching. Alert mode meant one thing. He had confirmed a target. I exhaled slowly, setting the laptop on the center console so I could see everything at once. Okay, I said. Now we're not guessing. I pulled up the environmental correlation chart, matching his current response pattern against training scenarios. Explosives possible. Narcotics possible. Large quantities of currency highly likely. That last one made me pause. Not because it was surprising. Because it fit. I zoomed further into the basement layout, isolating the exact position of the dot. Not near the door, not along a wall. Centered. Whatever was down there, it wasn't small. It wasn't something you tucked into a corner and forgot about. It was stored. Deliberately. I leaned back again, letting the pieces align without forcing them. Chelsea dragging Titan around the house, trying to make him perform. Titan ignoring her, returning to the same point. Bradley irritated, not curious. The reinforced basement. The undisclosed renovations. The money that didn't quite add up. My jaw tightened just enough to register the shift. You didn't need a guard dog, I said quietly, looking at the screen. You needed a sensor. I opened a secure note and started logging. Time, location, behavioral markers, environmental triggers. No assumptions. Just facts. That's how cases are built. Titan's vitals stabilized again, settling into a steady rhythm that told me everything I needed to know. He had found something. And now he was holding. Waiting. Exactly as trained. I checked the time. Late enough that most of the neighborhood had gone quiet. Lights dimmed, movement minimal. Inside the house, the party would still be going music conversation, Chelsea smiling through whatever cracks were starting to show. They would think this was contained. A family disagreement. A dog. They always thought that. I closed the Bradley file and opened a different channel, restricted internal, not something you accessed unless you were prepared to follow through. My cursor hovered for a second. Not hesitation. Timing. There's a difference between reacting and deciding. Reacting is fast, emotional, predictable. Deciding is deliberate. Final. I thought about my father standing in that kitchen talking about proper use. About Chelsea calling Titan defective because he wouldn't perform for her guests. About Bradley asking if he was trained like it was a feature you could toggle on and off. They had no idea what they were standing next to. No idea what they'd taken. No idea what they'd just exposed. I typed a single line into the log. Potential illegal storage, confirmation pending, asset in position. Then I saved it. Not submitted. Not yet. Observation first, confirmation second, action third. Always in that order. The red dot blinked again, steady as ever. I reached over, shut the laptop halfway, leaving the system in standby. Not off, never off. Just watching. I stepped out of the car, closed the door softly, and took one last look at the house. From the outside, it was perfect. Clean lines, soft lighting, expensive silence. From the inside, it was something else entirely. You really walked into this one, I said under my breath. Not to them. To the situation. Because this was the part people never saw coming. They thought they had taken something from me. What they had actually done was move a trained federal asset directly into the center of whatever they were hiding. I got back into the car, put it in drive, and pulled away from the curb without looking back. No urgency. No hesitation. Because the next move wasn't mine. It was theirs. And I already knew exactly where it would lead. 2 nights later, Chelsea hosted another event. Bigger, louder, more deliberate. Not a backyard gathering this time, a formal charity gala at a private military venue just outside the city. The kind of place where rank still meant something, where uniforms weren't costumes, and where people paid attention to details whether they admitted it or not. It was a calculated move. After the tension at her house, she needed a reset, a stage where she controlled the narrative again, where she could present the same image, polished, elevated, untouchable, and erase any doubt that might have slipped through the cracks. And of course, she brought Titan. I arrived late on purpose. The hall was already full when I stepped inside. Crystal chandeliers cast clean white light over polished floors and dark suits. Conversations layered over each other in controlled tones, measured, practiced, the kind of noise that comes from people used to being listened to. Chelsea stood near the center of it all. Exactly where she wanted to be. Her dress this time was darker midnight blue, structured sharp. Bradley stood beside her, one hand casually resting in his pocket, the other holding a glass he hadn't touched, and at her side, framed perfectly for anyone looking her way, Titan. The leash she'd chosen tonight was thinner, decorative, almost jewelry. A mistake. From a distance, it worked. He looked exactly like what she wanted, a disciplined, expensive, intimidating presence. Guests approached, commented, admired. She laughed, nodded, accepted it all like it belonged to her. But up close, nothing about him matched the story she was telling. His posture was wrong for a pet, too precise, too efficient. His eyes didn't wander, didn't soften, didn't engage. He was scanning. Chelsea didn't notice. She never did. Security upgrade, she was saying as I approached within earshot, her voice light, confident. We figured it was time. A man in a dress uniform studied Titan more carefully than the others. That's not just a guard dog, he said almost to himself. Chelsea smiled. He's still adjusting, she replied. A little stubborn, but we'll fix that. You don't fix training like his. You either understand it, or it exposes you. I stopped about 15 feet away. Far enough to avoid triggering anything prematurely, close enough to matter. Titan saw me instantly. It wasn't dramatic. No sudden movement. Just a shift, subtle, precise, unmistakable if you knew what to look for. His focus snapped into alignment, locking onto me like a compass finding north. Chelsea felt it before she understood it. Her hand tightened on the leash. She glanced down confused, then followed his line of sight. Her eyes landed on me, and everything changed. Not slowly, not gracefully, immediately. Oh my God, she said loud enough to cut through the surrounding conversations. There she is. Heads turned. Of course they did. That's my sister. She continued, stepping slightly forward, placing herself between me and the nearest group like she was managing a situation. She's been trying to take my dog all week. The words landed exactly how she intended, simple, clean, believable to anyone who didn't have context. She's not stable, Chelsea added, lowering her voice just enough to sound concerned. It's been rough since her last deployment. There it was again. The same angle, the same narrative. Different room. Same mistake. Bradley stepped forward, immediately positioning himself between us. You need to leave, he said under his breath, voice tight. Right now. I didn't look at him. Didn't acknowledge him. He wasn't relevant. If you don't walk out, he continued louder, now I'll have military police escort you out of here. A few people stepped back slightly, sensing the shift. They expected an argument. A scene. Something messy. I didn't give them that. I took one more step forward and stopped. 10 feet. Perfect distance. No tension in my shoulders, no change in my breathing. Just position. Chelsea's grip on the leash tightened again. Too tight this time. Her knuckles whitened. She pulled slightly, trying to reassert control. Titan didn't move. His entire focus stayed locked on me. Waiting. The room quieted. Not completely. Just enough. I took a slow breath in. Then I spoke. Titan. One word. Clear, controlled, not loud. The kind of command that doesn't belong in a room like this. A fraction of a second passed. Then the second command followed. Pass off, protect. Bradley opened his mouth. He didn't get a word out. The sound that came from Titan wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Low, deep, controlled. A growl that carried weight. Real weight. Chelsea's hand jerked instinctively, pulling the leash back. Too late. The leather snapped taut, then slack. Titan moved. Not wild, not chaotic. Clean. Precise. He crossed the distance in a single controlled burst and stopped directly in front of me, placing his body between me and them. Not touching me, not leaning. Blocking. That's what protect looks like. His posture shifted completely, muscles engaged, head low, eyes locked forward. On Chelsea. On Bradley. The growl deepened. Chelsea screamed. Not the kind of scream you rehearse. The real kind. She stumbled backward, heels slipping against the polished forearms, flailing for balance that wasn't there. She hit the ground hard, the leash still wrapped loosely around her wrist. Bradley froze. Mid-step. Mid-thought. This wasn't a situation he could talk his way out of. Control your dog, he snapped, but his voice cracked halfway through. I didn't move. Didn't respond. Because Titan wasn't out of control. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. Shoot it! Gregory's voice cut through the room, sharp, authoritative, automatic. That animal is dangerous. Shoot it. The word echoed. For a split second, no one moved. Then boots hit the floor. Fast, coordinated. Military police moved in from both sides of the hall, weapons raised, formation tight. Chelsea looked up from the floor, relief flashing across her face. This was her version of reality. Authority shows up. Authority fixes things. She clutched the loose end of the leash like it still meant something. Do something, she cried. That thing attacked me. Titan didn't even glance at her. The MP unit closed in. 1 step, 2, 3. Then they stopped. Not because of Titan. Because of me. The officer in front lowered his weapon first. He looked at Titan. Then at me. Then he straightened. His hand came up in a clean, precise salute. Area secured, Agent. Silence. Not the quiet from before. Something heavier. Confusion rippled through the room like a delayed reaction. Gregory blinked once as if he'd misheard. What are you doing? He demanded. I said shoot the dog. No one moved. No one even looked at him. The rest of the unit followed the officer's lead, lowering their weapons in unison, not relaxed, just redirected. A figure stepped forward through the crowd, then slow, deliberate, the kind of presence that shifts a room without raising a voice. The base commander. Full uniform, decorations that actually meant something. He stopped a few feet from Gregory. Repeat that, he said. Gregory turned toward him, relief flashing briefly. Order your men to detain her, he said quickly. She's out of control, and that dog. The commander raised one hand. Gregory stopped talking. Not because he wanted to. Because he understood the signal. You're asking me, the commander said, voice, even to arrest a federal agent in the middle of an active operation, so you can protect 2 civilians who just interfered with a classified asset. Silence. Chelsea shook her head weakly from the floor. It's just a dog, she whispered. No, I said. Every eye shifted back to me. It's not. Bradley's phone buzzed. Once. Then again. Then again. He pulled it out, irritation already on his face. Then it changed. The color drained so fast it looked like someone had flipped a switch. The siren started outside. Faint at first. Then unmistakable. I took 1 step forward. Titan adjusted with me still between us. Do you want to know why he wouldn't stop focusing on your basement door, I asked. No one interrupted. He's not guarding anything, I continued. He's detecting. Bradley's head snapped up. Too late. Explosives, narcotics, large-scale currency, I said, each word landing clean. And when he finds something, he holds. The main display at the front of the hall flickered to life. Live feed. Black uniforms, tactical movement. Bradley's house. The basement door. A breach. Light flooded the space. Then the camera settled. Stacks. Neat, organized. Bundled. Cash. A lot of it. Someone in the room whispered Jesus. The feed continued, agents moving deeper, opening cases, scanning documents. Those aren't mine, Bradley said quickly. No one responded. Because the evidence was already speaking. He looked around, searching for an exit. He found one. A side door. Unlocked. Unwatched. For a second. He turned. Ran. Fast. 1 word. That was all it took. Titan moved. A straight line. No hesitation. Impact. Bradley hit the floor, hard air knocked out of him in a single controlled takedown. Titan shifted instantly, pinning him face down, jaws inches from his throat. Not biting. Not tearing. Just there. A reminder. Get it off me, Bradley choked. I stepped forward. Out. Titan released immediately, stepping back to my side as if nothing had happened. 2 MPs moved in, securing Bradley with clean, efficient precision. Cuffs clicked. Final. The red and blue lights washed across the hall as they dragged him out. And for the first time all night, no one said a word. The doors closed behind Bradley and the sound didn't echo. It settled. That was the difference. Echoes belong to noise. This wasn't noise anymore, this was weight. The room didn't rush back to normal. No one picked up a conversation mid-sentence. No one reached for a drink like nothing had happened. The silence stayed where it was stretched across the floor like something solid, something people had to step around now. Chelsea was still on the ground. Not in the dramatic way she'd fallen heels, slipping arms flailing, but in the aftermath. The part no one performs. Her hands rested flat against the marble fingers spread like she needed the contact to convince herself she was still there. Her breathing had slowed. Not steady. Just slower. I didn't move toward her. I didn't need to. Titan sat beside me close enough that I could feel the heat from his body. Calm, centered, no leftover tension, no confusion. That's what control looks like when it's real. It doesn't spike, it doesn't linger. It executes, then resets. Across the room, people started shifting. Not away from the scene. Toward something else. Toward understanding. They weren't watching Chelsea anymore, or the door Bradley had been dragged through. They were watching me. Not curiosity. Recognition. Gregory felt it before he accepted it. He stood where he was for a moment, shoulders still squared, posture still intact. Years of habit don't disappear in a single night. But the structure behind it, the assumption that people would listen, that his voice would carry, had already started to fracture. He took a step forward. Then another. Slower than before. Measured. Not commanding. Approaching. He stopped a few feet in front of me, close enough that he didn't have to raise his voice. "This doesn't have to go any further," he said. "Not an order. A negotiation." I said nothing. He swallowed once, adjusting something in his tone that I'd never heard him adjust before. "I can fix this," he continued. "There are people contacts. This situation can be contained." Contained. Like it was a spill. Like it hadn't already moved beyond anything he could reach. I looked at him. Really looked this time. For the first time all night, he didn't look like a general. He looked like a man who had just realized his authority had a boundary. "No," I said. One word. Flat. Phenol. His jaw tightened, but he didn't push through it. He couldn't. Not here. Not now. "You're making a mistake," he said instead, quieter. "No," I repeated. "You did." Behind him, Chelsea shifted. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't controlled. She pushed herself up onto her knees, one hand sliding across the floor until it caught the fabric of my pant leg. Her grip tightened. Not aggressively. Desperately. "Please," she said. The word came out broken, like she wasn't used to saying it without an audience. I didn't know she added quickly, the words tumbling over each other. I swear I didn't know what he was doing. I believed her. That was the problem. Chelsea didn't plan things like this. She didn't build systems. She stepped into them, claimed what she could see, ignored what she couldn't. That had always been her pattern. I thought it was just... She stopped searching for something she could still hold on to, a dog. There it was. The line she should have understood from the beginning. I looked down at her. Mascara smudged, hair out of place, no performance left. Real. But reality doesn't erase consequence. I was jealous she said the words quieter now, more controlled, like she was finally saying something true instead of something useful. "You always had something I didn't." She let out a breath that didn't quite become a laugh. "I just wanted..." She stopped again. "Wanted what?" "Status. Control. Respect. None of those come from taking something you don't understand." "We're sisters," she said, finally tightening her grip slightly. "That has to mean something." I let the silence sit. Not to punish her. To make sure she heard what came next. Titan shifted once beside me, adjusting his position without breaking alignment. Always aware. Always ready. Not reacting. Waiting. "You took Titan," I said, my voice calm, steady, "because you thought I was weak." Chelsea shook her head immediately. "No, I didn't." "Yes, you did." She stopped. "Because we both knew it was true." "And you thought he was something you could show off," I continued. "Something you could control." Her grip loosened. "Not by choice. By realization." "He's not," I said. I paused just long enough for it to land. "He's a soldier." No one in the room moved. No one spoke. "And I'm his handler," I added, his command. I lifted my gaze to Gregory, then back to her. The military doesn't tolerate interference with its assets, I said, and I don't tolerate betrayal. No anger. No raised voice. Just fact. Chelsea's hand slipped away from my leg. Not pushed. Released. Gregory didn't speak again. He didn't argue, didn't threaten, didn't reach for another angle, because for the first time there wasn't one. I gave Titan a light tap on the shoulder. Let's go. He stood immediately, stepping into position at my side, perfectly aligned, as if the last hour had been nothing more than a routine adjustment. I turned. Didn't wait. Didn't look back. And the room did something I didn't ask it to do. It moved. People stepped aside, creating a clear path to the exit without being told, not out of fear, out of understanding, because they had just seen the difference between control and performance, between ownership and authority, between family and behavior. The doors opened as I approached. Cool night air met me on the other side, sharp and clean. I stepped through. Titan moved with me, silent, precise, exactly where he was supposed to be. Behind us there was no shouting, no one calling my name, no last attempt to rewrite what had just happened. Just silence. The kind that stays. I walked across the lot without rushing the rhythm of my steps, steady, grounded. Titan matched it without a command, adjusting when I adjusted, stopping when I stopped. That's what loyalty looks like. Not emotional. Structural. I reached my car, unlocked it, and paused for a second before getting in. Not thinking. Not replaying. Just still. Because for the first time in a long time there was nothing left to figure out. I knew exactly where I stood. And more importantly, where I didn't. I didn't lose a family tonight, I said quietly, more to the idea than to the moment. Titan settled beside me, calm, present, exactly where he belonged. I lost the illusion that I ever had one. I started the engine. The headlights cut through the dark road ahead, clean and direct. No noise. No hesitation. Just forward. If you've ever had someone take something from you thinking they owned it just because they held it for a moment, I want you to think about that. About what real ownership actually means. About what loyalty actually looks like. And about the difference between people who stand beside you and people who stand on you. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever had to walk away from something that looked like family but wasn't, leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. We share stories like this every day. Stories about truth, about boundaries, about what happens when people underestimate the quiet ones. So subscribe, stay with us, and let's keep going. The first call came at 10:47 p.m. The second came less than a minute later, then another, and another. By 11:15 my phone screen looked like it was having a seizure. 23 missed calls, 14 voicemails, 37 text messages, all from the same man who just hours earlier had told me never to contact him again. The same man who had written, "Don't call or come over again, we're done. And don't even think about the will, sweetie." I remember sitting on my back porch in North Carolina, still wearing my Army uniform pants and a faded gray t-shirt, staring at the endless notifications lighting up my screen. The night air smelled like wet grass. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked. And for the first time in years I laughed. Not because anything was funny. Because I finally understood something. My father thought he had just won. What he didn't know was that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. And before midnight he was going to realize it. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 38 years old. I'm a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army. For almost 20 years I believed that if I worked hard enough, sacrificed enough, and loved my family enough, eventually my father would see me. Not my rank. Not my accomplishments. Not the money I quietly spent helping them. Me. I was wrong. The strange thing about favoritism is that the favored child often doesn't notice it. But the other child notices every single time. Every birthday. Every holiday. Every family gathering. Every conversation. I noticed all of them. My older brother Ryan was 3 years older than me. Growing up, he could do no wrong. If Ryan got a C, Dad said school was unfair. If I got an A, Dad asked why it wasn't an A+. If Ryan crashed a car, it was bad luck. If I forgot to call for 2 days during military training, I was selfish. The rules were always different. The older I got, the more obvious it became. My father never hated me. That would have almost been easier. He simply valued Ryan more. And somehow that hurt worse. When I enlisted at 18, Dad acted as though I had personally betrayed him. "You're throwing your life away," he told me. You could work with family. I still remember standing in our driveway with a duffel bag over my shoulder. I need to do this. No, he said. You want to do this? Those words stayed with me for years. Because he was right. I did want it. I wanted purpose. I wanted challenge. I wanted a life bigger than our small town. The Army gave me all of that. It also taught me something my father never did. Respect has to be earned. Over the years, I deployed overseas multiple times, missed holidays, missed birthdays, missed weddings. I spent anniversaries sleeping in tents and Christmas mornings in combat zones. But every time I came home, I tried to reconnect with my family, especially my parents. I called every week, sent gifts, visited whenever I could. And when money became a problem, I helped. Quietly, without asking for recognition. When Mom needed surgery, I paid the portion insurance didn't cover. When the roof leaked, I wrote a check. When Dad's truck died, I replaced it. Every single time they accepted the help, but gratitude never lasted long, especially with Dad. Because somehow Ryan always needed more. Ryan was 50 kinds of charming and 1 kind of irresponsible. Businesses failed. Jobs disappeared. Relationships exploded. Credit cards maxed out. Yet every disaster somehow became somebody else's fault. And every time he fell, Dad rushed to catch him. The rest of us were expected to applaud. 3 weeks before everything fell apart, Dad called a family meeting. That alone was unusual. Dad hated family meetings. According to him, families should simply listen, not discuss, not debate. Listen. I drove 3 hours to attend. When I arrived, Ryan was already there. Mom looked nervous. Dad looked determined, which meant trouble. Dinner barely lasted 15 minutes before he got to the point. I've made some decisions about the future. Nobody spoke. Dad folded his hands. The estate will go to Ryan. Just like that. No explanation. No discussion. Ryan smirked. Mom stared at her plate. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Everything I asked. Dad nodded. Everything. I sat quietly for a moment. Then asked the question nobody else would. Why? His jaw tightened. Because he needs it. I almost laughed. Ryan was 41 years old, not 14. He needs it because he keeps making terrible decisions. Dad slammed his palm on the table. There you go. There I go, what? Judging your brother. I stared at him. Dad, you've paid his debts for 20 years. He's family. So am I. The room went silent. Dad looked away first. That hurt more than anything he could have said, because it answered the question. So I stood, picked up my keys, and left. The next morning I woke up to the text. No phone call. No conversation. No attempt to fix things. Just words. Cold. Final. Don't call or come over again. We're done. And don't even think about the will, sweetie. Sweetie. That word annoyed me more than the rest. Like I was still 10 years old. Like he was dismissing me with a pat on the head. I read it twice, then smiled, and replied, Yes, sir. Nothing else. No argument. No defense. No anger. Just 2 words. Then I put my phone down. For the first time in my life, I stopped chasing my father's approval. The silence that followed felt strange, almost uncomfortable, then surprisingly peaceful. I spent the rest of the day cleaning my house, organizing closets, sorting paperwork, doing all the small tasks people ignore when they're emotionally exhausted. Late that afternoon, I opened a storage box I hadn't touched in years. Most of it contained military records, old photographs, letters from deployments, memories. Then I found a large yellow envelope. My stomach tightened instantly. I knew exactly what it was. The envelope my grandfather had given me 15 years earlier. The one he told me never to lose. The one I had promised to keep safe. I sat down slowly. Outside rain tapped softly against the windows. For several moments I simply stared at the envelope resting in my lap. I hadn't opened it in years. Hadn't even thought about it recently. But now something felt different. Something felt important. Almost urgent. I ran my fingers across Grandpa's handwriting. My chest tightened with memories. Of fishing trips. Sunday breakfasts. Long talks on his porch. He had always understood me in a way nobody else did. Especially my father. And suddenly I remembered something he had told me during our final conversation. 1 sentence. 1 warning. At the time it had seemed strange. Now it felt like a message waiting to be understood. I looked at the envelope again. Then at the growing pile of missed calls beginning to appear on my phone. The first few were from Mom. Then Ryan. Then Dad. Again. And again. And again. I didn't answer. Instead, I carefully opened the envelope. And what I found inside made me realize my father had absolutely no idea what was about to happen. The envelope smelled faintly of old paper and cedar wood. For a moment I was no longer sitting alone in my house. I was 23 years old again, standing beside my grandfather's hospital bed. The memory arrived so vividly that I could almost hear the steady beep of the heart monitor. Almost feel the cold hospital air against my skin. Back then I had just finished officer candidate school. I was young, determined, and convinced that hard work could solve almost anything. My grandfather had asked everyone else to leave the room. My father, my mother, Ryan, even the nurses. When the door closed, he motioned for me to come closer. His hands looked thinner than I remembered. Age and illness had taken their toll, but his eyes were still sharp, still strong, still the eyes of a man who had spent his life building something that mattered. "Emily," he said quietly. "Yes, Grandpa. There's something I need you to do for me." I remember pulling a chair closer. "You name it." A faint smile crossed his face. "You always say that." "Because I mean it." For several seconds, he simply looked at me. Then he reached into the drawer beside his bed and removed a large yellow envelope. The same envelope now sitting in my hands 15 years later. "I want you to keep this." "What is it?" "You'll know when the time comes." I laughed softly. "That sounds mysterious." "It is." The smile disappeared. His expression turned serious. "Very serious?" Then he said something I never forgot. "One day your father's choices will destroy this family." At the time, I thought the medication was affecting him. My father and grandfather had always argued. Nothing unusual there. But now, 15 years later, those words echoed differently. Like a warning. Like a prediction. Like a man who knew exactly what was coming. Back in the present, I carefully removed the documents from the envelope. The first several pages looked familiar. Property records, tax filings, business agreements. Nothing dramatic. At least not at first glance. I kept reading. Page after page. My military training had taught me patience. Details matter. Small things become big things when people ignore them. By the 20th page, I stopped breathing for a second. Then I read the paragraph again. And again. Because surely I had misunderstood. But I hadn't. The family land wasn't legally my father's. Not completely. In fact, a large portion of what everyone referred to as Dad's property had never actually belonged to him. The ownership structure was far more complicated. Grandpa had established a family trust decades earlier. Most of the assets had been transferred into that trust. Dad had been named trustee, manager, caretaker, not owner. That distinction changed everything. I leaned back in my chair. Outside, rain continued falling against the windows. Inside, my heartbeat felt louder than the storm. I kept reading. The deeper I went, the more uncomfortable I became. Because suddenly dozens of events from the past 20 years started making sense. Dad had always acted like the family assets belonged to him. Completely. Absolutely. But legally that wasn't true. His authority came with conditions, responsibilities, restrictions. And according to these documents, Grandpa had been extremely specific. One clause immediately caught my attention. I read it 3 times, then a 4th. The language was clear. If the trustee used family assets primarily to benefit one heir at the expense of others, if the trustee violated fiduciary responsibilities, if the trustee demonstrated favoritism that endangered the long-term interests of the family trust, then oversight authority could be transferred. Not automatically, but through legal review. I stared at the name listed beneath that clause. My name, Emily Carter. For several moments I simply sat there, motionless. The room suddenly felt smaller. I wasn't shocked because I might inherit something. I genuinely didn't care about the money. What shocked me was that Grandpa had anticipated this exact situation 15 years ago. Long before the latest fight. Long before the text message. Long before tonight. He had seen something. Something everyone else ignored. Something I had spent years pretending wasn't real. My father's favoritism. I closed my eyes, and memories came flooding back. Ryan's failed construction company. Dad using family funds to bail him out. Ryan's second business. Another rescue. Ryan's divorce. Dad paying legal fees. Ryan's tax problems. Dad handling those too. Every crisis. Every mistake. Every bailout. At the time I dismissed it as parental loyalty. Now I wasn't so sure. I turned another page. Then another. My stomach dropped. There were financial summaries. Detailed ones. Grandpa had apparently ordered independent audits during the final years of his life. Several notes had been attached. Handwritten. Meticulous. Concerned. One note stood out. Repeated transfers without proportional benefit to trust beneficiaries. Another. Excessive support provided to Ryan Carter. And another. Potential future risk if pattern continues. I rubbed my forehead. This wasn't just favoritism. This was documentation. Evidence. Years of it. Suddenly my phone buzzed again. Dad. Calling. I let it ring. Then another call. Ryan. Ignored. Then Mom. Ignored. For the first time in my life, I wasn't interested in defending myself. I wanted answers. At nearly midnight, I found the final section. A sealed letter addressed specifically to me. My hands shook slightly as I unfolded it. The handwriting was unmistakably Grandpa's. Emily, if you're reading this, then one of two things has happened. Either your father finally learned fairness, or he didn't. I smiled despite myself. That sounded exactly like him. I kept reading. You will be tempted to protect people who refuse to protect you. You always have been. That is one of your greatest strengths, and one of your greatest weaknesses. The words hit harder than I expected, because they were true, painfully true. I had spent years helping people who rarely appreciated it, years earning love that should have been freely given. The letter continued. Do not confuse kindness with surrender. Do not confuse loyalty with obedience, and do not allow guilt to make decisions that wisdom should make. By the time I reached the final paragraph, my eyes were burning. Not from sadness, from understanding. The last sentence stopped me cold. When the time comes, call Richard. He'll know what to do. Richard. I knew exactly who that was. Richard Holloway. Grandpa's attorney. The man who had handled nearly every legal matter in our family for over 40 years. The man Dad rarely spoke about anymore. The man I hadn't seen since Grandpa's funeral. I glanced at the clock. 12:07 a.m. Far too late for a call. At least for most people. But Richard had always been different. I searched through old contacts. To my surprise, his number was still there. My thumb hovered over the screen. For a moment I hesitated. Making that call felt like crossing a line. Like stepping into a future I couldn't yet see. Then my phone vibrated again. Dad. Calling for the 8th time. A text arrived seconds later. Emily. Please call me. Another appeared. We need to talk. Then another. It's important. I stared at those messages. The same man who had disowned me less than 24 hours earlier suddenly wanted a conversation. Interesting. Very interesting. I set the phone down, then dialed Richard Holloway. The call connected on the second ring. A tired voice answered. Hello, Mr. Holloway. A pause, then recognition. Emily. Yes, sir. Another pause followed. Longer this time. Almost as if he had been expecting this moment. Finally, he exhaled slowly and said words that sent a chill through my entire body. I've been waiting years for this phone call. For a few seconds after Richard spoke, neither of us said anything. Rain continued tapping against my windows. The digital clock beside the couch glowed 12:09 a.m. And somewhere deep inside me, a feeling I hadn't experienced in years began to stir. Not anger. Not revenge. Certainty. The kind that arrives when scattered pieces finally start fitting together. Richard cleared his throat. Do you have the envelope? Yes. All of it. I think so. No, he said quietly. You don't think so. You need to know so. I looked down at the document spread across my coffee table. Then yes. Good. The relief in his voice was unmistakable, as though he had spent years worried those papers might disappear, or be destroyed, or never be found at all. Your grandfather trusted you, he continued. More than Dad. A soft sigh came through the phone. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. Richard was silent, which told me everything. He asked me to scan several pages and send them immediately. By 2 a.m, we were still reviewing documents. By 3, he had confirmed what I already suspected. The trust was real. The conditions were real. The violations were potentially very real. And my father had absolutely no idea. When I finally climbed into bed, the sun was only a few hours away. My phone contained 38 missed calls. I slept anyway. Better than I had in years. The next morning began with another message from Dad. Emily. Call me. No apology. No explanation. No acknowledgement of what he'd written. Just a demand disguised as a request. I didn't answer. Instead, I made coffee and drove to Richard's office. His building sat on a quiet street 2 towns away. The same red brick structure it had been for decades. When I walked inside, Richard looked older than I remembered. His hair had turned almost completely white. His shoulders seemed thinner. But his eyes were still sharp. Very sharp. He greeted me with a handshake, then immediately got to work. For 6 hours, we reviewed records. Financial statements, property transfers, trust reports, tax documents, correspondence. The deeper we dug, the worse things looked. Not because my father had stolen money. He hadn't. At least not in the criminal sense. The problem was something else. Something more complicated. For years, he had treated trust assets like a personal safety net for Ryan. Whenever Ryan failed, trust resources appeared. Whenever Ryan struggled, trust resources appeared. Whenever Ryan made another terrible decision, trust resources appeared again. The pattern stretched back nearly 15 years, one rescue after another, one exception after another, one justification after another. By late afternoon, Richard removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. I've spent 42 years practicing law. That long. Unfortunately, I smiled. He didn't. Emily, I've seen a lot of families destroy themselves. The room grew quiet. But this? He tapped a thick stack of papers. This wasn't about money. I knew exactly what he meant. Because he was right. The money was simply the symptom. The real disease was favoritism. Years of it. Decades of it. And everyone around my father had been forced to adapt. Mom learned not to argue. Ryan learned not to take responsibility. And I learned to expect disappointment. The following week brought more discoveries. Some painful. Some almost absurd. Meanwhile, my father continued calling. Every day. Sometimes multiple times. I never answered. Not because I wanted revenge. Because for once I wanted the truth before the conversation. And every day his messages became more desperate. Please call me. We need to clear this up. This has gone too far. Emily, answer your phone. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years I had been the one chasing him. Now the roles were reversed. One afternoon Richard called. I need you to see something. An hour later I was sitting across from him again. He slid a folder toward me. Inside was a copy of a proposed sales agreement. I frowned. What is this? The family land. My stomach tightened. Several hundred acres. The property Grandpa had spent most of his life building. The property every family gathering revolved around. The property Dad swore would stay in the family forever. They were selling it. Or trying to. I continued reading. A development company. Luxury housing project. Multi-million-dollar transaction. Projected closing date. 3 weeks away. I looked up. Does Ryan know? Richard laughed. Not because it was funny. Because the answer was obvious. Ryan helped arrange it. Of course he did. I leaned back. The disappointment hit harder than anger. Because despite everything I had still hoped there were limits. Apparently there weren't. The next few days felt surreal. Word spread quickly through town. People began congratulating Dad. Congratulating Ryan. Talking about the deal. Talking about the future. Talking about the money. Then came the barbecue. The celebration. The party that would eventually become one of the most humiliating moments of my father's life. I wasn't invited. That detail surprised exactly nobody, but several people who attended later told me what happened. Dad stood in the backyard holding a drink. Ryan beside him. Friends and relatives everywhere. And for the first time in years they looked victorious. Like men who had finally won. One guest eventually asked about me. According to 3 different witnesses, Dad laughed. Actually laughed. Then said, she chose the army over family. Someone asked if I would challenge the sale. Dad shook his head. Number. The confidence in that single word was astonishing. He doesn't know, Richard said when I later told him. Number. He really doesn't. And that was the problem. My father wasn't being malicious anymore. He was being careless. Careless people eventually make mistakes, big ones. A week before the scheduled closing, Richard finished the final review. The conclusion was devastating. The trust violations were undeniable, documented, extensive, legally actionable. For several minutes I simply stared out his office window. Cars passed below. People walked sidewalks. Life continued normally. Yet I knew mine was about to change. Do you want to proceed? Richard asked. I didn't answer immediately. Because despite everything, this was still my father. The man who taught me how to ride a bike. The man who attended my high school graduation. The man who once carried me into the house after I fell asleep in the truck. People are rarely all good or all bad. That's what makes family so complicated. Finally, I looked at Richard. What happens if I do nothing? He didn't hesitate. The sale moves forward. And after that, the trust may be damaged beyond repair. I nodded slowly. The answer wasn't difficult anymore. It was simply painful. 3 days later, official notices were prepared. Legal reviews were completed. Emergency motions were ready. Every document sat neatly inside a black leather folder. Waiting. The closing date arrived on a bright Thursday morning. The kind of morning that feels too peaceful for disaster. I woke before sunrise. Put on my army dress uniform. pressed every crease, polished every button. Not because I wanted attention, because Grandpa would have expected professionalism. By 8:30 I was standing outside my house, the black folder under my arm, my phone buzzing again. Dad. Calling. I silenced it, then climbed into my car. An hour later I pulled into the parking lot outside the law offices where the sale would be finalized. Luxury SUVs filled the lot. Investors had arrived. Bank representatives had arrived. Developers had arrived. And inside that building my father was probably smiling, certain he had already won. I stepped out of the car, adjusted my uniform jacket, picked up the folder, and walked toward the entrance. Because in just a few minutes everyone inside was about to learn something my grandfather had known for 15 years. The wrong person had been in control all along. The receptionist looked up as I entered the building. For half a second I saw confusion cross her face, then recognition, then surprise. Not because of who I was, because of what I was wearing. Army dress blues have a way of changing a room before a single word is spoken. People notice. They straighten up. They look twice. Not out of fear. Out of curiosity. I thanked her politely and followed the directions to the conference room. As I approached the closed door, I could already hear voices inside. Laughter. Confident laughter. The kind people make when they think everything has already been decided. I paused for 1 second. Not because I was nervous. Because I was remembering my grandfather. His porch. His voice. The envelope. The warning. Then I opened the door. The room immediately fell silent. Every head turned. My father's smile disappeared first. Ryan's disappeared second. Several investors looked confused. A banker adjusted his glasses. One of the attorneys frowned slightly. Nobody had expected me. Especially not my father. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Then Dad pushed his chair back. Hard. What are you doing here? His voice carried across the room. I calmly closed the door behind me. Good morning, Dad. I asked you a question. I heard it. His face reddened. I told you not to come. The words hung in the air. A few people exchanged uncomfortable glances. I looked directly at him, then smiled. Not mockingly, not cruelly, just calmly. I'm not here as your daughter. The silence that followed felt almost physical. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Ryan stared at me. Dad blinked. What does that even mean? Before I could answer, another voice came from behind me. Perhaps I can explain. Richard entered the room, carrying 3 large binders. The moment my father saw him, something changed. Only slightly. But I noticed the confidence wasn't completely gone. Yet, however, a crack had appeared. A very small crack. Richard walked to the table, placed the binders down, and sat. Richard, Dad said, "What is this?" An issue that should have been addressed years ago. The room grew even quieter. One investor looked at another. The banker stopped reviewing documents. People could sense something was wrong. They just didn't know how wrong. Dad laughed nervously. This isn't the time. Actually, Richard replied, it's exactly the time. The attorney representing the development company spoke up. Is there a problem with the transaction? Richard nodded. Yes. That single word changed the atmosphere immediately. Every person in the room became alert. Pens stopped moving. Papers stopped turning. The room shifted from celebration to caution. Dad crossed his arms. Richard, enough. Number. The answer came instantly. Firmly. The kind of firmness that only comes from someone who knows they're standing on solid ground. Then Richard opened the first binder. My responsibility today is not to protect anyone's feelings. He looked directly at my father. My responsibility is to protect the trust. The trust. Several people frowned. The developers looked confused. One banker immediately started taking notes. Dad's expression hardened. There's no issue with the trust. Richard opened a document. There is. Then another. And there has been for years. Ryan finally jumped in. This is ridiculous. Richard didn't even look at him. Instead, he continued turning pages, one document after another. One financial record after another. One transfer after another. The evidence piled up slowly, methodically, relentlessly. No dramatic speeches, no shouting. Just facts, which are often far more dangerous. Within 15 minutes, the atmosphere in the room had completely transformed. The investors no longer looked excited. They looked concerned. The banker no longer looked relaxed. He looked worried. And my father looked increasingly uncomfortable. Then Richard revealed the trust agreement. The original version, signed decades earlier. The room became completely silent. He explained how ownership had been structured, how authority had been delegated, how fiduciary responsibilities worked. how trust assets were supposed to be protected. The developer's attorney interrupted. "Are you saying Mr. Carter does not own these properties outright?" Richard nodded. "Correct?" The man froze. "So who does?" Richard slowly turned toward me. Every eye in the room followed. The silence felt endless. Then Richard spoke. "The trust beneficiaries." Another pause. "And under specific conditions, oversight authority transfers to Lieutenant Colonel Emily Carter." Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed. Dad looked stunned. Ryan looked confused. The investors looked alarmed. The banker looked like he suddenly wished he were somewhere else. What Ryan finally said. Richard calmly handed over copies. Nobody argued anymore. Because now there was documentation. Signatures. Legal records. Evidence. The conversation changed immediately. Questions started flying. Dates. Transactions. Conditions. Reviews. Responsibilities. The developers looked increasingly uneasy. One banker stepped outside to make a phone call. Another attorney began reading faster. Very fast. The celebration was over. Dad stared at me. "How long?" His voice sounded different now. Smaller. "How long have you known?" I held his gaze. "Long enough." His jaw tightened. "Long enough for what?" "Long enough to give you every chance to do the right thing." Those words hit him harder than anything else said that morning. I could see it. Because he knew they were true. For years I had given him chances. Hundreds of them. Probably thousands. I had tolerated insults. Dismissals. Favoritism. Disrespect. Not because I was weak. Because I kept hoping. Hoping one day he would choose fairness. One day he would choose family over pride. One day he would see me. Instead he sent a text message. And accidentally started the collapse of everything he thought he controlled. Ryan slammed both hands on the table. "This is your fault." The accusation echoed through the room. Several people looked embarrassed for him. I simply watched. "Mine. You planned this." "Number." "Yes, you did." "No, Ryan." For the first time all morning my voice became slightly harder. "I didn't create this situation." I looked directly at him. "You did." His face reddened instantly. Because deep down he knew. Every bailout. Every rescue. Every excuse. Every special treatment. All of it had led here. Nobody else. Him. The final blow came 30 minutes later. The bank formally suspended participation. The development company postponed closing indefinitely. The transaction could not legally proceed until the trust dispute was resolved. Millions of dollars froze instantly. The room felt colder. Heavier. Final. The sale was dead. At least for now. Nobody celebrated. Not even me. Because despite everything, victory didn't feel the way people imagine. It wasn't exciting. It wasn't satisfying. It was sad. Watching your father lose isn't enjoyable. Even when he's the one who caused it. Especially then. By noon, the meeting was effectively over. People began leaving. Quietly. Awkwardly. Nobody wanted to be there anymore. One by one, they disappeared. Until only a handful remained. Ryan left first. Angry. Humiliated. Blaming everyone except himself. The same pattern he had followed his entire life. Then Mom left. Tears in her eyes. Unable to look at anyone. Finally, only Dad remained. Standing beside the conference table. Looking older than he had that morning. Much older. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he asked the question. Not as a businessman. Not as a father. Just as a man. Was I really that unfair? The room suddenly felt very quiet. I thought about lying. Making it easier. Softer. Kinder. Instead, I told him the truth. Yes. The single word landed like a stone. Dad looked down. For the first time in my life, he had no argument. No defense. No explanation. Just silence. A few moments later, he picked up his coat, turned toward the door, and walked away. Not angry. Not shouting. Not blaming. Simply defeated. The man who had controlled every family conversation for decades left without saying another word. And as the door closed behind him, I realized something important. The real consequences hadn't started yet, because sooner or later he was going to go home, and finally sit alone with the truth. I thought the hardest part was over. I was wrong. The meeting had ended. The sale had collapsed. The truth was finally out. But families don't unravel in conference rooms. They unravel afterward. In kitchens. In living rooms. In late-night phone calls. In quiet moments when people are left alone with consequences. That evening I drove home with the radio off. The black folder sat on the passenger seat beside me. Sunlight stretched across the highway. Traffic moved steadily. Everything looked normal. Yet nothing felt normal. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't carrying the weight of proving myself to my father. The burden was gone, and strangely enough, that felt heavier before it felt lighter. I arrived home around 6, fed my dog, changed clothes, made coffee I didn't need, then sat on the back porch. The same place where this whole chapter had truly begun. The air was warm. The sky glowed orange and purple. Crickets chirped in the distance. Peaceful, until my phone buzzed. Dad? I stared at the screen. Didn't answer. A minute later it buzzed again. Dad. Again. Then Ryan. Then Mom. Then Dad. Then Ryan. By 9 o'clock the calls were coming every few minutes. By 10 they became almost constant. Voicemails started arriving, one after another. I listened to Ryan's first. Emily, call me. The second sounded less confident. Look, this got blown out of proportion. The third was angry. The fourth was desperate. The fifth was almost pathetic. For years, Ryan had always assumed somebody would rescue him. Dad. Mom. Sometimes even me. Now there was nobody left. The system that protected him had collapsed, and he had no idea what to do. Around 10:30, I listened to a voicemail from Mom. Her voice cracked almost immediately. Please call me sweetheart. I closed my eyes. Mom had spent most of her life trying to keep peace between people who refused to change. That role ages a person. I knew she was hurting, but I also knew something else. Keeping peace and fixing problems are not the same thing. For decades, she had confused the two. The phone buzzed again. Dad. Again. I ignored it. At 11:15, another message appeared. Then another. Then another. The man who once took days to return calls was suddenly sending messages every 15 minutes. The irony wasn't lost on me. Finally, just before midnight, a text arrived. Not a demand. Not an accusation. Not an order. Just 4 words. Can we talk? I stared at the screen. For a long time. Then another message appeared. Please. That word hit differently. Because I honestly couldn't remember the last time my father had used it with me. Not as a formality. Not as a habit. But sincerely. I didn't answer that night. Or the next morning. Or the next day. Sometimes people need time to understand what happened. And my father had spent nearly 40 years believing he was right. That kind of belief doesn't disappear overnight. 3 days later, I finally called him. The silence after he answered lasted several seconds. Then he spoke. Emily. His voice sounded tired. Older. Smaller. Hi, Dad. Another pause. I didn't think you'd call. I looked out my kitchen window. Neither did I. Where are you? I asked. Home. His voice cracked slightly. The house feels awfully quiet. I knew exactly what he meant. For years, noise had protected him. Activity. Control. Distractions. Now all he had was reflection. We agreed to meet the following afternoon. Not at his house. Not at mine. A small diner halfway between our towns. Neutral ground. The kind of place where nobody holds home field advantage. When I arrived, he was already there. Sitting alone in a booth. Coffee untouched. Looking out the window. For a moment, I barely recognized him. Not physically. Emotionally. The certainty was gone. The authority was gone. The armor was gone. He looked like a man carrying something heavy. I sat across from him. Neither of us spoke immediately. Finally, he looked up. I owe you an apology. I waited. Because apologies are easy. Accountability is harder. He nodded slowly, as though understanding exactly what I was thinking. Then he surprised me. He didn't defend himself, not once. Instead, he told the truth, the whole truth. About Ryan. About guilt. About fear. About mistakes. After Grandpa died, he had convinced himself Ryan needed protection. Then more protection. Then even more. Eventually, helping Ryan became his identity. And somewhere along the way, he stopped noticing the damage. Or maybe he noticed and chose not to see it. Sometimes those are the same thing. The hardest moment came when he looked directly at me and said, "You never needed me." I shook my head. "That's not true." "It is." "No, Dad." My voice softened. "I needed you." The pain on his face was immediate. Visible. Real. Then why didn't I see it? For several seconds I couldn't answer. Because the truth was complicated. Because people rarely become who they are overnight. Finally I said, "Because you were too busy worrying about the child who kept falling to notice the one who learned how to stand." His eyes filled with tears, actual tears. I had seen my father cry exactly twice in my life. At Grandpa's funeral. And now, the diner became very quiet. Neither of us rushed to fill the silence. Some moments deserve space. This was one of them. Eventually, he looked down at his hands. I thought you'd come back no matter what." There it was. The truth beneath all the other truths. Not favoritism. Not money. Not even Ryan. Entitlement. He believed my love was guaranteed. Unconditional. Permanent. No matter how poorly he treated it. And for years he had been right. Until he wasn't. I reached across the table. Not because everything was fixed. Because some bridges deserve an opportunity to be rebuilt. Even slowly. Even carefully. "I'm not angry anymore," he nodded. "But things can't go back to the way they were." Another nod. This one heavier. "I know." And for the first time I believed him. Over the next year our relationship changed. Not magically. Not perfectly. Slowly. The way real healing happens. Ryan eventually got a job. Kept it. For once. Mom stopped trying to manage everyone else's emotions. Dad started listening more than talking. And I finally stopped carrying responsibilities that never belonged to me. The trust remained protected. The land remained in the family. And together with Richard I established something Grandpa would have loved. A scholarship fund for military families. Every year it helps young men and women pursue education and service. Every year Grandpa's name lives on. Exactly the way he deserved. About 13 months after the meeting, I received a text message on my birthday. Simple. No speeches. No drama. No conditions. Just one sentence. "I'm proud of you, kid." I stared at the screen for a long time, then smiled. Not because the words fixed the past. They didn't. Nothing can. But because they arrived honestly. Finally, after all those years, I put the phone down, looked out toward the evening sky, and continued living the life I had built myself. Not because my father finally approved, but because I had learned something much more important. Your worth does not begin when someone recognizes it. Your worth was there all along, and sometimes the greatest victory isn't proving people wrong. It's finally stopping the need to prove anything at all. If this story touched you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to walk away from someone you loved in order to protect your peace? Let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. We share new stories every day. And if you enjoy heartfelt family dramas like this one, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next journey. Until next time, take care of yourselves and the people who truly value you.